Please give a warm welcome to composer Justin Hurwitz and writer-director Damien Chazelle.
Thank you so much.
So amazing to have you guys back in Santa Barbara.
No, I've missed it. It's been too long.
Good to hear. Justin, I'll start with you. When I entered the film, I talked a little bit about your collaboration through the years since you guys were in school. And in this project, you started early on, correct? And like you were actually seeing the storyboards and the script, and vice versa. You actually were composing and then inspiring the storyboards and the script as well.
Yeah, as soon as there was a draft of the script, Damien sent it to me, and we started marking it up, figuring out where there would be music and where there wouldn't. And a lot of spots it was obvious because there was a Sydney performance or something, but other spots it wasn't obvious to me. It was all in Damien's head, but it wasn't clear to me. So I had to figure out where some of those performances would spill over into montage or into other sequences, and structure a lot of that music. Of course, there's the score that you write later, but there was about an hour of music we had to write before the movie could be shot for those performances and those other sequences. So yeah, I was working to the script and then the storyboards. Damien was cutting storyboards with kind of hand-drawn, stick figures and stuff, and I was writing demos to that, and then he was tweaking the storyboards to the music. I was tweaking the music to the storyboards, back and forth until they were being developed together, so they would fit eventually.
I also noticed, Justin, when I watched the film, is that there's so many storylines because of the characters, and you were musically you were like the glue that I was always aware of the space of each narrative because of the music. Can you tell us about that challenge?
Well, we love to have scores that keep coming back to a handful of themes that mean something or belong to something. So we seeded a bunch of melodies at that first party and then keep bringing them around. And they have, based on how they were introduced or what character was involved when the song came on the first time, they have some meaning. So to get to play with that meaning, and this song kind of belongs to Jack. This is sort of romantic and his sort of romanticism, his wistfulness. There's a theme that belongs to him. There's Voodoo Mama, which belongs to Nellie. That's kind of her big dance number. And then we keep bringing that material back in very disguised ways. During her montage, if everything's going right for her, that the riff of Voodoo Mama is kind of hidden underneath as sort of undergirding that cue. And then when they're in the blockhouse, when they're in that creepy third floor of the blockhouse, there's this tension music as we're realizing that the money's counterfeit and all that, and there are these pitched gongs that are playing the same do the same tune from Voodoo Mama, very disguised. But again, we were thinking about tying us back a little bit to Nellie. At least that's what I was thinking about. If this doesn't go well, like Nellie's screwed. So I was trying to come up with some kind of connection there. So we're usually doing that, is trying to think of what melody belongs to what and how can we twist it and play with it and have it still mean something.
Mr. Chazelle, I want to see this film again. The foreground, midground, and background, the frame is bursting with life, and I was just aware that there's always something happening visually, like the snake sequence, that you are arranging things in the. Can you tell us about that approach?
Yeah, it was sort of the hope, or one of my hopes from the get-go would be to have this be a movie of crowds, have you really feel a crowd as an organism. Sometimes that can be a crowd of 10 people, sometimes it's 1,000 people, but this sort of choreographing and orchestrating frames with lots of people and lots of activity in them. So I was looking at a lot of stuff by Fellini, for instance, who's a master at sort of orchestrating crowds. Coppola as well. You look at like Apocalypse Now. That was a bit, even though very different subject matter, but a huge reference for sort of, one thing I love about Apocalypse Now is that he's always putting things that a normal movie would put front and center, he's putting them way in the background. He's, like a helicopter carrying a cow, or like a tanker rolling into a house, an explosion, things that, my first instinct would be, well, we got to put 6 cameras on that and shoot it 6 ways to Sunday and put it front and center because it's so cool. He's just putting kind of deep in the background. You might not even notice it the first time you see the movie. And so, like, that was hugely inspirational, this idea that that actually what makes something feel alive, what makes something feel rich in the frame and feel not planned, even though you're planning it all, but kind of helps disguise that, is when you feel like there's things going on just off frame. There's things going on that maybe you're catching just a glimpse of, but you're just seeing the beginning or the end of it, and it's continuing past
Why
it.
did that visual style fit what you were trying to say with Babylon?
Well, I think just the idea of a world that's teeming with life and that's also always on the verge of losing control. There's always this, like, it's dancing giving way to fighting. It's sort of sobriety giving way to intoxication. It's sort of decorum giving way to the animalistic instincts underneath. There always had to be this kind of interplay, because that to me was really central to Hollywood. I mean, you could argue Hollywood at any time, but especially in this time when Hollywood was, I would say, still learning how to control its impulses. It was still very much this kind of, do what you want, free for all, Wild West, just this side of the circus kind of thing, because movies were still new, they were still a low art, according to polite society. They were vulgar, they were tawdry, so they attracted a certain kind of people.
Right.
And once Hollywood became respectable, a lot of that sort of behavior got weeded out or got sort of exactly kind of buried underground.
Tell me about the 360-degree view that we get even from the get-go, and the fact that I was aware of the horizon and.
Well, I mean, to me, LA is always about the horizon. It's this sort of horizontal city to me. New York, for instance, is a vertical city, but LA to me just lends itself to the 2:40 ratio and anamorphic and that kind of distortion where you just feel the horizon almost bending as it goes away from you. But especially LA in this time, I think that was one of the things I kept being surprised by doing the research, was that I'd find these photos of areas that I now know very well, Cahuenga or sort of stretches of Wilshire Boulevard, that were just, even as late as 1926, just palm trees or orange groves or dirt. Just truly, you'd sort of get a snapshot of an area of LA that we now know, we think of as so developed and congested and full of, constant traffic and horns honking, and you're seeing just like a cow kind of milling about, and someone sort of one horse, person on a horse kind of, you feel like you're looking at something 300 years ago, but it's really only 100 years ago, and there's something about that. So I wanted to make sure this movie captured that feeling of the horizon, the dust, the dirt, the light, all these things that are unique to California and Los Angeles.
But the fact that we, and the camera turns around and that we're seeing it 360, can you expand on that?
I mean, I like movies, especially if you're doing a period movie, you sort of already have the challenge of the audience feeling separate from what they're seeing on screen, and so I like to try to do whatever I can to demolish that boundary, So shots that feel like they are subjective or feel like they sort of have a life of their own, so that you kind of feel like you're sharing the experience of the characters as opposed to just kind of sitting back and watching the sort of proscenium. So, but it's hard, it's like, then you get into logistical challenges of, well, where do you hide the crew? Where do you hide the, and here we were just doing a lot of, sort of clever things like, we had, for instance, on the battlefield, you sort of get a big shot, which is Justin's big cameo. That he plays the conductor of the orchestra on the battlefield.
Okay.
So I got to see him really work for his money this time, which was good. But the camera kind of pans from the extras in the battlefield to the orchestra to behind the scenes, and you see a bunch of tents in the background. Well, those tents that's where we could hide all of our modern equipment and our normal crew and stuff. We had to have, you have to have sort of tents on any modern movie set and sort of a place like that. People need shade from the sun and all this sort of stuff. But instead of it being these kind of neon blue tents that you tend to see in modern, California shoots, we just used the sort of same white fabric that they used back in the day. And so it's like kind of doing the things you had to do anyway, base camp and stuff like that, but just making it period correct so that then, it kind of can blend into the background of the movie.
And I'm curious about the lighting. Outside, it's overexposed, and then total reverse in the inside is actually underexposed dramatically. Can you tell us the logic behind that approach?
Yeah, I think, I guess the logic behind it was that LA was this sort of place of very vivid contrasts and extreme contrasts, I would say. And so, so right at the get-go, the idea of building a city essentially in the desert, has its own kind of irrationality to it. The sort of initial kind of, spots of LA settlement, they weren't even by the ocean. They sort of didn't even go that far. There's a real sort of, it's like you're tracking all across the desert of the country, and you get to just a few miles from the ocean and decide, yeah, right here. And you just put this, and so there's this weird kind of irrationality to it, and I think that sort of pervades in the whole feeling of LA at that time. It's the contrast. It's the sort of open air desert, but then right next to it you'll have like a castle that looks like it's from Europe because some person with a lot of money decided they wanted to recreate Versailles or recreate, the Duke of Normandy's, a castle or something. So that idea that you'd be outside and just feel like you're in one universe, and that's a universe of sun and sweat and sand, but then you go inside and you feel like you're in the sort of the deepest recesses of someone's fantasies, someone's imaginations. Lena Sandgren, the amazing cinematographer on this, who I've worked with on a bunch of films, he and I, and actually Florencia Martin, the production designer as well, all of us kind of, our joke was sort of that the exteriors of the movie needed to be sort of Sergio Leone, or There Will Be Blood, something like that, and the interiors needed to be Visconti. They needed to be sort of like just, vivid reds and sort of everyone dressed to the nines, and you're in a European kind of fantasy. And sometimes the heart of the movie would lie in sort of having both in the same frame at once, So like when we're on the silent era lot for the first time, you see the dust in the desert, but then within these little quadrangles of sets, you see the vivid greens of a fake jungle or the vivid pinks of a, sort of old China backdrop or, so that kind of juxtaposition became sort of the heart of it for us.
Justin, the music is so propulsive, and I was even noticing that the editing is dry. It's been, you're pushing the editing, or the editing is inspiring the music. Can you tell us about that approach of the propulsion of the music?
Yeah, that goes back to exactly what we were talking about before, from that storyboard phase when we're developing music and storyboard together, all the way straight through the year of post-production when we're editing. We're just trying to get music and picture to really work together. And through the whole editing process, we always get offices next to each other, something we've been doing for the past few movies. So I don't have to send off a cue, wait for feedback. That's pretty inefficient. We can be all day, every day. I'm in the editing room, he's in my room. We're just going back and forth, passing picture and passing demos, my demos back and forth, until they're fitting, until they are, really working together. And I'm, adjusting music to fit picture, and they're adjusting picture to fit music, so we can land in places very confidently. And it doesn't feel like a musical phrase has been abridged in order to get there. It doesn't feel like picture has been shortchanged to get there. We can just sort of have the music and a cut land very confidently and have it feel like it was meant to be that.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that this is not your typical 1920s jazz movie music that we've grown accustomed, you go completely against the grain, something we've never heard before.
Yeah, we definitely we wanted to stay away from the sound of 1920s jazz because it's a very familiar sound. It's quaint. at least the jazz that was recorded and that we think of as 20s jazz, it's pretty gentle. And this is such a, aggressive. We wanted music that would be unhinged and really more in your face than what we think of as 20s jazz. So we very often had the lineup of a 20s band with some horns and rhythm section, but use them in very different ways. It's very like riff-based writing. So we were talking a lot about rock and roll. We were talking a lot about like Rolling Stones riffs and AC/DC riffs, and what would happen if you wrote those sort of pieces that were driven by that kind of riff, but instead of an electric guitar playing the riff, it was unison horns. Also a lot of like really driving beats, a lot of dance beats, a lot of, really sort of pounding kick drum 808 type percussion, sort of a dance hi-hat, which is not 20s, but you could have had it in the 20s. They had hi-hats. Just things that would just add more of a propulsion and more of a dance feel.
And I think like it's just making me think of like what Justin's saying, that I think part of the fun of it for us was a little bit kind of imagining what could have been, So like Justin references how little was actually recorded at the time. It's really true. We sort of only have a sliver of the music that actually existed, and you get kind of a little bit of a feeling of this whole other range of music of the time just by reading reports or memories or people describing oral history type stuff of describing what the sort of things they would hear at a party or at a club were. And it was always, just it sounded wilder, it sounded crazier, it sounded more kind of also culturally schizophrenic. Like you'd have all these influences that you wouldn't expect, sort of Middle Eastern sounds, Asian sounds, Native American sounds mixing in with the sort of jazz we're familiar with, or with sort of European symphonic. It was just this sort of this cauldron, and then I think also the other thing that we kind of forget is that we think of jazz very much as this sort of like I'm a drummer, so I think of jazz very much as just this sort of ding 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 ding. It's the swung eighths on a cymbal. That's kind of become the language of jazz percussion from the 30s onward. But in the 20s, you kind of listen to, say, early Duke Ellington stuff. It's actually much more just a kind of straight four. It's much more of a boom 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 boom, which in a way is actually much closer to much later 808 dance music. And so I think what Justin did that was so brilliant was kind of creatively make a bridge between that sort of early predecessor to swing, pre-swing jazz, and create kind of a bridge between that and what you would more normally hear today, literally in a club, with the sort of pounding bass and that sort of thump that gets very guttural and feels sort of like you feel it in your belly.
Well, the other thing that, when I was watching the film that I kept thinking about is like we're seeing them doing so much coke, and I was kind of like, the music sort of is
We're trying to keep this to be a classy conversation, Roger. I don't.
Well, me. No, for Sydney, Justin, the instrumentation is like the traditional 1920s instrumentation, but you actually you deploy it in a sort of modern way. Can you tell us about that contrast?
Yeah, so like I said, it's the lineup of a band that is believable back then, but they're playing a lot more. It's a lot more unhinged. It's really wailing trumpets and screaming saxes. And speaking of screaming saxes, we have Jacob Cesny. So there he is, Jacob Cesny.
Yeah. Welcome, Jacob.
The star saxophone player from all those sessions. And Jacob really unlocked the sound for us, because we came into these sessions with the concept of, okay, we want screaming saxes, there's a leap between that and the actual sound. So like in jazz, you write very often chord changes and some slashes, and you give them the opportunity to improvise. And we opened it up to a lot of different sax players, and people would naturally kind of fall into more of a 20 sound or more of a bebop sound. And I kept trying to describe, somewhere like, with one foot in the sort of tonal world of the piece that was written, but also just like really go for it, really kind of be unhinged and wild. And Jacob just knew exactly where that line was and laid down these just incredible wailing solos. and that really unlocked the sound of so many of the pieces in this score.
And you see him on screen too. I'll never forget the first time that Justin was doing a recording session with him, and Jacob, I don't know what inspired you to do this, Jacob, but just put 2 saxes into his mouth at the same time, just started double sax playing. I remember seeing that going, well, that's in the movie. We got to put that in the movie.
Yeah, he's blowing into both. He's got one hand on either one, and he's playing both of them at the same time.
We talked a little bit about the editing, but in other films that we tend to see, the editing becomes invisible, and in your film, it's out there. Tell us about just being overt in the editing.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with Tom Cross, the editor, since Whiplash. So as Justin was saying, the 3 of us, me, Justin, and Tom, we've developed a sort of shorthand, and it is this kind of triangle in the editing room where we're sort of passing things back and forth. I think Tom and I do share a sort of love for more overt kinds of editing. I think we're always talking about, well, speaking of the silent era, like people like Eisenstein and the types of editing that you saw in his films, or Pudovkin's or Kuleshev's or Vertov's, and any of the sort of Russian filmmakers of the 20s. You kind of get this sense of angularity to the cutting, these sort of quick, very quick, but there's a percussiveness, there's a rhythmicness to it. So I sort of love that. I love editing that can push the limits of how fast you go, but not in the style of sort of what I think we often see in Hollywood, sort of music video kind of editing that just, to me, becomes noise, but where there's somehow a precision to it that makes you feel like the speed has a rhyme and a reason, and you still can kind of follow, even if on just a guttural level. Right angles giving way to other right angles, or diagonal this way gives way to diagonal that way. It's very sort of graphic kind of approach to sort of how to do it that we just love. And I think in this movie, trying to push that language to the extreme, coupled with Justin's music, which, as you said, sets its own kind of tempo, I'd say it was very much a 3-way sort of collaboration.
I mentioned this to Justin, and I'd love to hear your take on both of you on this, is the fact that I was blown away when I watched the film, because I thought that it was a culmination of everything that the 2 of you have done, and Cross as well, and Sandgren, where you have the staccato rhythm of Whiplash, you have the lyricism of La La Land, and then the sort of muscular action sequences, and immersion of First Man. How do you guys feel about that assessment?
I like that assessment, because it's funny. It was something I described to both Tom and Lena Sandgren before we shot a frame. Was that because they would both ask me, well, what do you think the style of the movie is? And I sort of, just drawing from what we had done together, sort of like, it's going to be somewhere between Whiplash and La La Land, because it's about the sort of magic of the movies at their birth. So it needs to have this kind of romanticism, and to me that often can be expressed through long camera movements and circular camera movements that give you a sense of, like, the camera's dancing. But at the same time, it's got this angry aggressiveness to it. It's everyone's on cocaine. Everyone is sort of striving, sometimes in very ugly, desperate ways, and there's this darkness to it. So there needs to be this kind of angular, staccato, sort of adrenaline-fueled editing to it, that in many ways is the opposite of the sort of circular, Ophusian, La La Land style. So somehow we have to find a way to have those both in the same movie and not have it feel incoherent. And so the sort of craft in the language of the movie in terms of shooting and cutting did become very much this sort of give or take. And the movie sort of changes shape as it goes. It goes from something that sort of lends itself to lyricism a little more and lots of camera movement to, once sound comes in, then suddenly they're stuck on a sound stage and the camera's barely moving at all. It's all just about the editing. And the editing becomes very kind of confrontational, becomes very sort of, you like kind of almost feel like you're being punched by it. So those kind of things were very intentional, and it was sort of, let's try to use those 2 kinds of styles and have them in dialogue with each other in a way that hopefully says something about the story and the way the world is changing in the movie.
And I love that idea that it's kind of like a sort of a a culmination of, or a combination of the things we've done. I did feel that way when writing the finale number, because in fact, we were calling it the epilogue number for a while, because it parts of the concept reminded me of what I did for La La Land, bringing all the melodies back, but the strategy is so different here. Instead of kind of like elegantly segueing from one theme to the other like we did in the La La Land epilogue, this was, how do we bring them all back at the same time? Every melody from the movie, every theme, they all come back at the same time, and they're all kind of staggered and working in counterpoint to create a cacophony. And it's not a total cacophony. I mean, they're really sort of well thought out in terms of how they're placed, so that they each get their moment to sort of poke out. I was almost like relying a little bit on some of the Bach study I did in terms of how counterpoint, how melodies can sort of work with each other at the same time. So it was. Yeah, a similar concept to La La Land, but executed very, very differently. And on top of it all, you have crazy drum solos, which we were going back very much to the process of making the Whiplash solo, where it's just bringing drummers into the studio and shaping that wild solo performance. Here, not only do we have one crazy drum solo, but we have two. We have Peter Erskine on one side of on the right side, coming out of the right speakers, just going absolutely nuts. We have Gary Novak coming out of the left speakers, going absolutely nuts. And again, figuring out how to bring each of those solos to the forefront so that it's sort of a mess, but also there's real purpose to it. So it was like a very complicated, cacophonous take on some of the things we've done before.
Speaking of cacophony, the sound design, Damien, in particular, the moment where Nellie walks into her first day of shooting, and I was listening to all this different dialogues around in the set. Tell us about creating that sort of oral world.
Well, I just was very lucky to have just the greatest sound team I could ever imagine having. Steve Morrow was did all the on-set sound. We'd worked with him on La La Land, and then the post-production sound design, sound mixing was Eileen Lee, Millie Yatru, and Andy Nelson, same team from La La Land as well. And so again, a little bit of a shorthand sort of existing already, which is great. Where we sort of we kind of know we share the same tastes and the same sort of basic parameters. But then in this case, trying to sort of look at what we'd done before together and push it to, the next degree. Make it that much more immersive, that much more sort of experiential. I guess I especially also like, trying to make things experiential that normally wouldn't seem to lend themselves to that approach. So for instance, the scene you talk about of sort of trying to shoot a sound take, there's something very sort of simple and dry and dull about that. It doesn't necessarily feel like life or death if you just describe it on a page. But that was sort of, that's a kind of challenge that I sort of love. It's like, can you make something that sort of everyday and banal feel like you might as well be at war, or you might as well be sort of, trying to defuse a bomb that's about to kill everyone. And that's where sound really kind of comes in. It's that sort of, beyond what the dialogue is able to do, beyond what the sort of the subject matter would even lend itself to. If you just sort of use the sound in such a way that you feel truly there, and you can even hear heartbeats, you can even hear sort of breaths and gasps. Hopefully, the hope is that you get this thing deep in your gut that tells you something bad is going to happen, and maybe that things are even life and death, even though presumably, of course, the irony, actually, someone does die in this one. But put that to the side. You sort of know instinctively that there's something major going on, and I love that, where you can just use form, you can just use sound or sort of the form of cinema to turn the micro into the macro, or the minor into the major. That's always a sort of beautiful thing that cinema is kind of uniquely equipped to do.
And I have to ask you about the party sequence. The party sequence to end all party sequences in movies. Can you walk us through a little bit? I I still can't get over the spider cam that flies in and out and takes it all in. How did you plot that out?
That was, well, you know, going back to sort of what Justin was saying, it kind of started with the music. I mean, I guess, you know, I had a basic description on the page, pretty basic, just of sort of what would be going on.
Orgies and people.
Exactly.
Coke, orgies.
Exactly. Stuff that's very easy to write and then very hard to execute. You know, 300 people drunk out of their minds, various degrees of nudity, going going crazy in a room. And you sort of give that to an AD or something and go, okay, good luck. It's challenging. But Justin then went and sort of took that and wrote these sort of incredible pieces of music that just throbbed with a sort of energy that just dictated to me how to shoot and cut it, you know? And so based on Justin's music, I then storyboarded, cut the storyboards to the music. So all the shots that sort of you see in the movie and all the sort of, that kind of shooting and editing pattern, it all sort of came from the music, which we then were lucky enough to have on set. That's the other thing that, you know, normally, even with action sequences or something, you know, you shoot them silently, you often cut them silently. But in this case, the music was blasting live, you know, playback blasting on set every day of that shoot. So that had its own sort of energizer kind of effect, where even when, you know, outside it might have been, you know, 10 a.m. and people are still rubbing their eyes and everyone's sober and it's sort of, you know, you're in the middle of LA, modern LA, but inside, it was, you know, just pedal to the metal, all-time music, energy, sweat. You know, you sort of created this vortex that I think would have been very hard if we'd had to, you know, for instance, shoot it silently. Everyone had the sort of the soundtrack in their heads as they were shooting. And
Justin, was the soundtrack set for that sequence once it started rolling, or were you inspired by what you were seeing visually and altered it?
There's always some adjustment you have to do in post. But those songs, that main song where you come in and the spider cam and the bottle hits the door right as the door is being shut on the final note of the song, that was pretty much locked. Yeah, most of the things were pretty much locked, and then you know, in post sometimes you make little trims if they make little trims, but. A lot of that music, especially for that party, was figured out pretty much and actually recorded. We were in the studio with Jacob and with all the guys in 2021 before the shoot to get, you know, not just demos but actual real advanced mixed recordings of all this music.
And we've talked about all of your collaborators, but I have to bring up my favorite collaborator of yours. Sorry, Justin. Your wife, producer, and she also is in the film. She plays Ruth Adler. Yeah. You know, tell us about working with her, in particular, shooting her while she is directing a film. And I even noticed some mannerisms that are familiar to me. It looked like she was channeling you.
I know. I remember when you first told me that, I suddenly, this like panic went over me of like, I'm not like that. What? You know, it was kind of a perfect role for her because she's a no bullshit, take no prisoners, you know, sort of personality. She's very much not the character that she plays on screen. But it was something where, I actually didn't have to do much in the way of directing. It was this funny kind of meta thing where that was our first week of shooting, I remember, was shooting the sequence where Margot's character goes onto the set for the first time. Olivia's character is first dismissing her and then suddenly realizing that she's a once-in-a-generation talent and getting excited by that. That whole thing was our first week, and so I was, you know, sort of directing my wife to direct Margot to, you know, and so it was this weird kind of, you know, Hall of Mirrors aspect to it, but it was great. It was actually the perfect way to begin, in retrospect, to begin the whole shoot of this movie, because it did have that Hall of Mirrors thing to it, you know, making a movie about making movies, and all of us have those experiences of, you know, Olivia as well, of the best days on set we've ever had and the worst days on set we've ever had, you know? And so that's just a reservoir of memories and emotions that we could just keep drawing on with all the extremes in this movie. This is a movie of high highs and very low lows, often in the context of movie making. So, you know, in that sense, I don't know, there maybe was something somewhat cathartic about it for all of us.
And I also love that scene in particular because I mentioned to the audience you've done you were working on this for 15 years. You did so much research. And I remember somebody telling me, like, oh, that scene, a woman directing? It's like, yeah, in Hollywood in the 1920s, there were directors like Dorothy Asner that were, were directing, but we sort of history has sort of erased those aspects.
I agree, and I think that's it became one of the, almost like the missions of the movie for me, was to try to shine a light on all the things that Hollywood history has kind of swept under the rug or sort of obscured. There's so much of the 20s Hollywood that really has been forgotten, and that ranges from the level of decadence and insanity and drug use and everything that you see in the movie, to exactly what you're saying, the kinds of people who were holding positions of power in Hollywood at that time. There's again, I think all of it comes from the fact that it was still this sort of new art form that wasn't considered respectable. So, the East Coast and the moral arbiters of the country and polite society, they hadn't yet gotten their hands fully on Hollywood. So as a result, you see, you had ironically, way more female directors in the 20s than you did a decade later. You have, people like Lee Jun-Lee's character, Lady Fei Zhu, wearing multiple hats, performing and writing. Lots of people, actors producing, writers, editing and directing. You have a moment where someone like Manny could actually get his foot in the door. All these sort of things that I think in many ways became harder once Hollywood became more of a big business, became more respectable, and suddenly, it had to comport to the norms of polite society at that time, and that did not allow those kinds of things as much. It took another, 50 years, arguably, to sort of get any of that sort of freedom back.
Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I could go on talking to you guys forever, but so glad you came, Justin. Big fan. Damien, you know how I feel about you? Yeah. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you guys.